That's what I need.
Oh,
Lots of clarity.
lots of clarity. There you go. Yes.
Yeah, I need clarity. So is it hopefully it was in a bottle. I could use it.
So we call you Claire. Is that what we call you now, Claire?
There we go. Claire. There we go. All right. So we're back to just a brief review. Last week we started in the beginning of the woes where we're stopping some horses, and the God reminds us that he has bigger plans for all of these people, and we can't see the timeline. So we're into the part where some of the story is really unfolding, and it reminds us that trials and tribulations are part of God's plans for us. And even though we don't like it and we don't like being in trials and tribulations, it is for the better good. And we found out that Babylon's time was up, that their creditors were calling the loan in, and that they were going to be punished. Babylon stole from others, and now someone bigger and badder was going to steal from them. So there was a bigger bully on the block, and there always is. And Habakkuk always shows us that God accepts repentance from his people, no matter what's happening. And there's always the chance for repentance, and his actions will always guide us back into his will and how to better serve him. So I wanted to start off today with going to Daniel 5, 1 through 4. And just take a look at, exactly what was going on in Babylon and how they lived. If somebody could read that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can do that if you want. Daniel 5, 1 through 4.
Right.
Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of thousands. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone.
Thanks, Charlie. So what stands out to anybody in this passage here regarding Babylon and how they conducted their lives?
Godless was the first thing.
Yeah. And what could you insert was their God? What's the point in there that they were praising?
They like to drink wine.
That's John. I'm glad you pointed it out, because all throughout Habakkuk there's references to drunkenness and wine, and that is a great point. So it's obvious that they like to pop a cork. That's definitely true. So one thing that stood out to me was it says they had a great banquet for thousands of his nobles and drank wine. So thousands of his nobles, that would indicate the extent of their dynasty and their reach, but it also would indicate how they were governing, and they probably had a pretty tight control over their populace. And I wanted to point out that Belshazzar pointed to what his dad Nebuchadnezzar did by taking the golden goblets and the holy sacraments from the temple of Judah, and they were really mocking God in this verse here. And of course, we find out later on that this all comes to a head, and that they have to pay the piper. So back to Habakkuk 2. And we left off at verse 8.
Hey, Tim.
Yes.
I was just going to say, it's almost like the guys were trying to, it says they were worshiping and praising, things made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. But, it's almost like these guys were portraying themselves like they were gods or something, like they were higher than anybody else, their egos were big. I mean, come on, they're drinking out of gold and silver cups, it's states that they're drinking out of gold and silver cups. Like, imagine
Yeah.
if we were drinking out of gold cups, dude. Like, or
No, that's a great
Yeah.
point, Jake.
you know,
And-
you look at like Saddam Hussein and like those guys, like how they had like gold toilets and stuff, you know, in their
Yeah.
bathrooms, you know, like I don't know. I
And
just think of
it's not just that they were drinking out of gold and silver cups. There was 1,000 of them that were doing this. So it's this massive picture of like, look at how big and powerful we are and how great we are. I think you're right.
yeah. Right.
So if there's
That's
1,000
John.
nobles, they would probably have had their wives or some of their servants and concubines that were there also. So this gathering could have numbered into the 5 to the 6 to maybe 10,000 might be a little too big. But you bring up a great point, Jake, and something I thought about. Cultural reference here is when I read that, I immediately thought of the Indiana Jones movie, I think the Temple of Doom, when Indiana goes into the cave and he's with the evil scientist there, and the guardian of the cups, asks him, pick the one that the king drinks out of. And obviously the guy picks the one from the golden chalice, and it was the wrong pick. And Indiana picks the one that was a wooden kind of hewn, it was all kind of beaten up, and that was the one of a carpenter. And that's what I immediately thought of that. And then to the Last Supper, they probably were not drinking from golden cups. They were drinking from very crude, goblets or cups or something like that. So yeah, great insights. But it really, really shows the depths of Babylon's, with the word I'm thinking of, the depths, how far they've fallen, and just how they live their lives. So I wanted to just review a little bit about verse 4, the just will live by faith, and that's central to Habakkuk, and it's the first time it shows up in our text. And it's also, as John discussed, and I brought up, that it's a pillar of our faith, and it shows up all throughout the New Testament. And these woes here are an example of living by anti-faith. And a woe is the opposite of blessed, and it's the direct opposite of what the faith statement is. And we look through these woes and we see how God is punishing or is going to punish Babylon, and it shows how the anti-faith will eventually show up. So I wanted to kind of start off on that. I'm going to share my screen, because if there's an anti-faith position, there's obviously a faith position. Let's see if I can get this right here. Bag away. There we go. And just 1 minute here. I'm having trouble getting to stuff. That's fine. I promise I've used this before. Zoom puts a text box, a big box right in the middle of my screen that doesn't always show. So Habakkuk 2:9. So once again, if there's an anti-faith position, there's a faith position. So I wanted to compare and contrast this and look at the scripture through Habakkuk 2. And so Babylon lived by selfish ambition, and that was verse 6 through 8. And Christ, he came to serve. And feel free to throw in anything else that you'd like to add to the faith position here. I always like to, when I'm reading the Bible and scripture, regardless if it's Old Testament or New Testament, I like to see or try to find where Christ is, where I'm a firm believer that in every passage and word and sentence of the Old Testament, Christ is there. We just need to dig him out and find where he's at. Sometimes it's very obvious, but other times it's not very obvious. So we have selfish ambition, verse 6 through 8. We have fear and coveting. That's how Babylon was living. And we see it in verse 9 through 11, but with Christ is peace, generosity, and humility. Babylon obviously used people. We've seen this all throughout, not only Habakkuk, but also all throughout scripture. And they use slaves to further their means, and there was a lot of ill-gotten gains, and that's verses 12 through 14. Of course, Christ would bless people, and the ultimate sacrifice, he died for us. Drunkenness, and we've all seen that. We just saw that in Daniel 5, but it's prevalent all throughout Scripture that Babylon really worshiped the grape, and that's 15 through 17. Christ was very sober-minded. We did see him imbibe, but we never hear of him of being drunk or acting like he was drunk. And then, of course, the big one, and this is the main one, idolatry, and that's verse 18 through 20. But it's also, you can see that all throughout Habakkuk 1, 2, and 3. And of course, Christ said, I must be about my Father's business. So there was obviously no idolatry there. Any thoughts or comments regarding this compare and contrast here on faith and the anti-faith position?
I like the compare and contrast because I think there's a lot of it here, and it's very helpful for us to. We can think of God in these simple terms and miss that he's just different than everything else, and so it's good. I like it.
And that's a great point, John. And we saw that in Habakkuk, the first chapter, where Habakkuk is crying out to God for some sort of justice, and then God says, "Hey, I'm going to bring you justice, but you're not going to like it." So once again, it points. Hbakkuk just keeps pointing in my mind, in my eyes, of the timeline that God does not have, and that we are so linear, and he is so not linear, and his ways are not our ways at all.
I look at this list and I see the one side is flesh serving, and the other side serves the spirit. One side is definitely can be established in a timeline, and the other one seems timeless.
That's a good point. Yeah, and then reading Daniel 5, it really shows everything on that anti-faith side. You know, the drinking, the coveting, they're using people, the idolatry of worshiping their gold and their silver and other, man-made items. So, in Habakkuk, was Judah punished for living the way Babylon was on the anti-faith side? Had they lost all of their direction towards God and his laws? Had they fought? I guess I'm kind of answering my own question, but I wanted to kind of point this out. If it's hard to see that Judah was actually living that way. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a small thought on that, which is, you can't say blanket statement that everybody was living this way. I mean, we know Hbakkuk, he's a prophet of God. He's most likely not living that particular way, but I think it's a good generalization to say they were. And one of the things that's interesting, if we read through Kings and Chronicles, what we see is the people follow their king. When the king leads in a direction of worshiping false gods and going away from God, the people follow the king. And then when there's a king that is like, no, we're going back to who God is and we're going to go serve him and follow him, the people follow that, which I just find very interesting. And so the point that I was making is, a lot of times we can see from the behavior of the king how the people are also behaving, because they have a tendency to follow their leaders, which is a little scary in our world, right? Because it means that in general, people follow those who are in leadership.
Yeah, that's a good point. And all throughout Habakkuk, studying for this and reading this and discussing with you guys, I keep going back to events of today and what's going on today. And that's a great point you bring up. And I think it's important to point out that should be one of the objectives of the church, is to make sure that society doesn't fall off the cliff with the leadership they're following. And I think sometimes the church shies away from that. And I have a question later on, if we get to it, about how we engage in the culture wars and to what extent we're supposed to, and if we're supposed to. And it's a really, to me, it's a fascinating topic. So All right, so let's start off verse 9. I'm very ambitious today. I actually planned for 5 verses, but I don't know if we're going to possibly get there. So, all right. So verse 9, somebody want to read verse 9?
Yeah, what sorrow awaits you who build big houses with money gained dishonestly. You believe your wealth will buy security, putting your family's nest beyond the reach of danger.
So, Jake, what version was that?
NIV?
NIV. Okay.
Oh, sorry, NLT.
Okay. Good. And that's the one. So it's interesting to read different versions. I think, John, you have King Jimmy there. Could you read what King Jimmy says about that in verse 9?
Yeah, I have the new verse, King
Well,
James.
let's do the new one, and then we'll go to the old one with the other John.
Oh, sorry, you were talking to the
No,
other
go
John.
ahead. I want to hear some other verses here because they break it down a little bit better.
It is different in mine. Yeah, it says, "Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of disaster."
And John,
mine is almost identical. It says, "Woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of evil." Exclamation point on the evil.
Yeah.
That's so. Does anybody have any other translation that's markedly different from this, from that, the words?
I got the exclamation mark on dishonesty, John.
Wow. Okay. So I used to do my study in NIV, and when I read that, I was a little confused. But then I went to the New Living Translation, like Jake just read, and it said, "What sorrow awaits you who build big houses with money gained dishonestly." And when I read money gained, that really opened up the verse to me because it was talking about the money aspect and the ill-gotten gains, and that really threw open the doors to me on this verse. So what else can we see by this? How does this verse indicate how the Babylonians live? Now, we think of the Babylonians being the big bad guy on the block, and they were just dominating everybody. But what does this passage really point to on how they were living back at home?
I look at this passage like, well, when you're building your castle, you're going to want to put it up in a high point that you will see the enemy coming, and you'll be able to have the higher ground and a tactical advantage. And I'm looking at these people putting their nest up on high that they may be delivered from evil, like they have control. But if God wants to, he could chop that nest down. I don't care how high you build it.
Right.
So that's where I was thinking when I was reading this. I wasn't thinking, my version doesn't have the ill-gotten gains part.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question? Because
sure.
So when I read this, I got something slightly different than what you guys did, but that's just because of one of the words, which is house. And so it says, "Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house." And you guys are talking about a physical structure that they're living in, but I was thinking of like household, like the house being the family, all of the people that are in there. Do you think it means the physical house? What do you guys think about that?
That's a good question.
I like that you said that, John, because at the end it does say family's nest. Like, I don't know if the castle is their family, or a village, but I guess, I don't know. In those times, did they call the people that lived in the castle their family, or is your family actually your house?
Yeah, and maybe it doesn't matter because maybe it means the same thing either way. This idea of trying to get your family or trying to get your house in a position where it's untouchable, where people can't come and harm it. Maybe it's the same either way. It's just interesting. I kind of got that a little different.
Even if it wasn't, the next verse seems to imply what you said anyway.
Yeah.
It says it gives shame to your house, at least in the version that I'm reading.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
I don't want to jump ahead, but it seems like. Sorry. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Rich.
Good morning.
Like,
No, Rich, that brings up a really good point, because there's quite a bit of synergy between all of the verses that
Right.
we're looking at through the end of chapter 2. But that's a really good point you bring about, John. In my opinion, I think it definitely relates to both. And I wanted to kind of throw this out. This passage indicates to me that Babylon, at least back home, was living in constant fear of losing what they had ill-gottenly gained, and they're not secure in their lifestyle. They may even had a guilty conscience. I might be going a little bit too far with that, because they seem to self-medicate themselves out of that if they have the guilty conscience, which you see in real life today. People who are guilty on how they live, they just continue to delve deeper into their self-medication, whether it be drugs or alcohol or whatever they're using to do that.
So can I
Tim.
bring up another point? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, sorry. Just to piggyback on what you were saying as well, is that when you're living in that lane, that lifestyle, you better be looking over your back, because you're living in that lifestyle. So you're creating lots of enemies. So you better have your nest really high. You better have guardrails around it, because you're stealing, you're exploiting, you're doing all of these things. Eventually that it's going to come back. So you're going to have to do all these things to protect yourself, because you've now acquired so many enemies from every which way. And they knew that, or they possibly knew that. Just a thought process.
Well, back to the ill-gotten gains for the house, you were talking about, like, you think of, I mean, it's all of our goals in life is to create for the generations behind us, a sense of comfort. So however we want to build, we as Christians have, a comforter that's given to us. So we live in that comfort. But if you don't have that comforter, like Babylonians and all those people, yeah, that's the only way you can do it, is you got to keep, Howard Hughes, classic line, one of the richest guys in the world when he was alive, and on his dying bed, they asked him, they said, what's your desire? And he said, $1 more. And, it's so true, because, that's what they have to do. You have to keep amassing it. And like you said, you got to get the guards to protect it. And then, you got to build a bigger barn, everything. You have to keep changing and moving, because you have to keep amassing this wealth, because it's all rotting away and being stolen away and everything else behind you.
That would have been a good point to put up in the anti-faith position, and then cross over the faith. Acquiring just massive amounts of things, and then on the faith side, don't store up treasures on earth, store them up in heaven. Right. And you guys are bringing up great points, and it reminds me of a sports team. Just name any sports team that makes it to the pinnacle of their season, and they become champions. And as soon as they become champions, they kind of take a deep breath, and then they're immediately after the game clock is done, all of the other teams begin to plot and plan on how to take them down. And a lot of those teams try to, they try to build walls up, but they get complacent sometimes. Mm-hmm. And that's what the competition is all about.
Yeah, so I was question.
Yes.
Verse 9, who is God talking to? The Babylonians or the remnant of Judah?
I think the answer is both. I think this is the cool part that we're getting through here in Habakkuk, is these woes are, God is saying, if you do this, this is the consequences for doing it. And so it is for Habakkuk, if he's probably thinking, oh, this is comfort, because then the Babylonians, as they take over, they're going to also have this issue. But at the same time, God is telling them that because I'm getting all excited and my thoughts aren't clear, sorry. But what we see here, even with Habakkuk and his conversation with God, God's telling him, I'm going to have the Babylonians, the Chaldeans come and take your land from you. And he's like, how can you do that? You can't do that. And God is telling them, hey, this is what happens when you behave this way, then this is what's going to happen. So I think on the first level, it's Judah and the remnant of Israel. And then on the second level, it's Babylon and what happens to them afterwards. So I think it's both, Jody. It's a good question, but I think this is just a truth that God is telling everybody, that if you behave like this is what's going to happen to you.
Well, I've noticed that in the first phrase of this 9th verse, it says, woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house.
Yeah.
The evil covetousness. I mean, that's pretty strong language, but I'm not quite sure what he's referring to. What this evil is.
But we could easily find a way to point this back to Israel, because I mean the kingdom split up in two because of covetousness, and people wanted the kingdom, although God had promised it to a particular family, and so they were struggling as well. It's a good point. I wanted to bring up, sorry to shift gears, but I wanted to bring up another thing that I thought was cool, which is we see this, woe to him who covets an evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high. And I think what we read in Daniel is a good example of that. We see Belshazzar, he's got 1,000 lords. And I think one of the reasons you do 1,000 lords is so that you can protect yourself, right? You're like, I don't have to deal directly with the people. I don't have to worry about them revolting because I've got 1,000 of the leaders over them. And what he can do is you can just pit them against each other. So they're constantly busy fighting amongst themselves, trying to work things out. And the Nebuchadnezzar's family's mind, it is, hey, we're protecting ourselves and keeping ourselves safe by putting us a step away from everything and have these 1,000 lords fight each other off. If you're like a Star Wars fan, and maybe this Star Wars isn't a good example here, but you can see that with the Emperor Palpatine, where he does that. He sets up his empire with all these Moffs and everything so that they're fighting each other and trying to gain power and status, and the Emperor can kind of stay away from it. And I think we see the exact same thing with Belshazzar here.
Star Wars reference. I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. There we go.
Because it's real.
Yeah, of course it is. Well, next is Star Trek, but we can have a discussion on that another time. So, this is all good stuff, and I still go back to, it's that John brought up that when Jody asked that question, it's really showing Judah the anti-faith way of living as opposed to the faith way of living, and you need to decide where you're going to go. And once again, it's blessings and curses. If you're in the anti-faith, eventually I'm going to curse you. You may live your life like a king for a while, but I'm going to curse you. But if you live in the faith position, I will bless you. And I wanted to point out, while I was studying for this, I read something, and this is in relation to the physical aspect, excuse me, of Babylon and how they built their kingdom. It says history tells us that the walls around Babylon were approximately 300 feet high, so 30 stories. The height of the towers were approximately 420 feet. There were 250 of these towers irregularly disposed to guard the weaker parts of the wall. Babylon's walls stretched for hundreds of miles. So these guys were really, I mean, you talk about the Emperor Palpatine, this is on steroids. This Babylon, the head of Babylon was the Death Star, and it had another ring of walls around the Death Star. And I also read that some of the palaces within those walls were 600 feet high. So I don't know how many stories that is, but they just kept building higher and higher to look down on the people and to gain security. And I threw in a couple cross references here. When I was looking at this, there are dozens of cross references regarding how God will tear down the haughty that builds their nest up high. So Jeremiah 49:16, the terror you cause and the pride of your heart have deceived you. And that describes Babylon perfectly. Oh, dwellers in the clefts of the rock. So somewhere way up high. Oh, occupiers of the mountain summit. They're at the top. They're at the eagle's nest. Though you elevate your nest like an eagle, even from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. So, this is exactly what we're talking about here in verse 9. Obadiah 1:4. Though you soar like an eagle and make your nest, and once again, there's that metaphor of eagle and nest and making your castle way up in the stars. Even from there, I'll bring you down, declares the Lord. So the Lord eventually will bring that kingdom down, and of course we see that happen to Babylon eventually.
And as cool as they are so amazing. That's one of the natural wonders of the world, right? They have the hanging garden. They're humongous, they're powerful, and they fall in a day, and the walls are meaningless because the people who come in, the Medes and Persians, when they come in and take all of this, they just go underneath the I forget how they do it. Do they come through the cistern? But anyways, it's the walls don't protect them.
Right. And as we started off with verse 5 in Daniel, if anybody wants to go back to that later on, that describes exactly how Babylon falls. And it's pretty stark. I mean, they're just sitting around, having some cocktails once again, and they just come in and say, okay, you're done, kill the king, institute new people, and then they just mosey right on. It's like Babylon never existed. Well, of course, there's a supernatural aspect when the hand is writing on the wall, which have been
Right.
freaky. But
I can't help but see the whole thing being related, because when you have a covetous ruler who started all this with that kind of heart, you're not going to rule people very well. Right. And he probably ruled in it's sort of like, if you steal once, you're probably going to steal again to mass yourself. And that's what some of these kingdoms do. And you wonder if the people just said, you know what? Who cares comes, because our kingdom's not any better either. They sort of give it to the next, because no one really wants to fight for what was already there, because what they fight for is already stolen. So it's really interesting to kind of think about it that way, from a covetousness standpoint too, from a ruling government that's covetous and unjustly appropriates a lot of stuff from their people. So you wonder if that was part of it, where there was no army, there was nobody watching the wall or the cistern or whatever, because it sort of was falling apart at the seams already, because the way the empire was run. And then historically, that seems to verify that as well, because I think one of the commentaries I'd watched, documentaries on Babylon, the last king was always taking vacations or whatever, and he was gone, and he's sort of living a luxurious life really without ruling over people, because they had appropriated all his wealth for himself. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. And I think it's a good point, because it doesn't say woe to being a ruler of a country, right? It's woe to him who covets evil gain for his house. And I think it's a good point. If you're a ruler and you're fitting this category, there's a woe there, but there's not a woe for just being a ruler.
Right.
That's a good point. And Richard, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying Nebuchadnezzar, he was that way, but then, God showed him, and then he wound up honoring him, and so there's those, it's like you said, John, it's the whole nation. It's not just the person, so to say.
Richard, bring up a good point. And I, once again, reading these verses, there's so many tie-ins to historical aspects of kingdoms and empires, not just Babylon, but all kingdoms and empires, and how they fall and how they gain power. And a lot of empires will amass territories beyond their borders and enslave those territories, and encompass the peoples of those territories and force them to fight. And traditionally, armies that are forced to fight will do well in the beginning, but eventually they lose their zeal. And a lot of times, I know from being a student of Marxism, it's called fragging. They either do it physically by putting people behind their frontline armies with bayonets or guns and say, you take a step back, you're dead. So that encourages armies to fight on, or they threaten their families back at home. And like I said, traditionally, those armies fight like rabid dogs in the beginning, but as the fraggers disappear, their zeal to fight usually diminishes. And when no one has a bayonet in their back, they stop fighting. And then you see, like Rich said, those walls start to crumble all around, and the armies stop. They just don't want to fight anymore, because why should I risk my life for some Yahoo back there that's just chugging wine and messing around?
And we saw that there's so many great examples of that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We've seen it in the Iraq War. They had the Republican Guard who was doing exactly that. And as soon as their Republican Guards neutralized, and everybody's just like, I give up. You take the country, please come. And then and we're seeing it now in Ukraine with Russia, where they're sending their prisoners in to go fight, and they just want warm bodies in there to pressure them. And it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. But what we can see is God said, woe to them who do that type of behavior. So he's in trouble. He may not see it yet, but they're in trouble.
Yeah. I just, once again, I just keep going back to Marxism and the Soviets and how they rule and how they gain power. I studied that for a long time, and the horrors that they would do when they would conquer lands to subdue the populace is mind blowing. And I can imagine, obviously they're not the first ones, and what Babylon must have been doing to the people of Judah to gain their, and not to gain, but to force them into down on their knees. So this is all good stuff. Just in one verse. Wow. We're now moving on to verse 10. All right. So can somebody read verse 10 for me?
I will read it. You give shameful counsel to your house, cutting off many peoples, and sin against your soul.
All right. So I like that, sin against your soul. So you're in the New King James, right?
That's right.
So once again, when I read in my study, the NIV, it says, your schemes will bring shame to your house because you destroyed many nations, you will self-destruct. And I was like, you were self-destruct, but people were just blowing up simultaneously. But when I saw that you will sin against your soul, that's when this verse really opened up to me. And once again, it goes back to the anti-faith position. And I immediately thought of 1 Corinthians 6:18, where if you commit sexual sin, you sin against your body. So God is actually saying here, this is you're doing something that will sin against your mortal soul, and if that happens, you're doomed. You can't be saved. So, any thoughts on verse 10 here that bring any more clarification?
Well, I think when you sin against your soul, it will lead to some of those other behaviors, like the drunkenness or the drug use, to where you're trying to mask those feelings. Because let's just face it, there's some things that are just wrong. And if you do something either against your own personal morals or for whatever the reason is, it just wounds you deep down inside. And without the Lord's forgiveness, you're doomed to trying to seek that forgiveness elsewhere through drunkenness or drugs or idolatry or other behavior that's on the left.
And those
I think, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, those behaviors that you just mentioned, John, were those push you further away from God, and they just keep blocking God from your thought process. And once again, it's a self-medication aspect, and then you start to idolize those sins. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to mention that we started this off where God is, he says there's the prideful man, and then there's the man who trusts or has faith, and they're saved by faith. But this idea of a proud man, they're their own standard, they're their own, they're everything. And I think this verse is interesting because when I think when it says you sin against your soul, I get this idea of you've got this standard of what's right and wrong, your own internal standard of what's right and wrong, and you still don't care. You're still going to do what you know is wrong to yourself. You're sinning against what you even think the standard is. And so there's this idea here of when there's judgment, God can say, hey, I don't even have to talk about how you've rebelled against God. We can just look at how you've rebelled against your own standards, and you're not worthy. It's crazy.
It's almost like that you're going against your own nature, right?
Yeah.
To your point, you're doing so much to either convince yourself or to manipulate yourself. I mean, we do that sometimes, I guess, when we know to do right and we do something in a direct opposite direction. We're like, I know I was supposed to do this, but I didn't do it. But I think when we see in this world now where you literally are mutilating yourself or you're doing other things just to prove a point, just to get to the other side, it's pretty scary.
John has mentioned several times in this study about I'm blanking on it. Would you say the proud man? What was it?
Yeah, those who are proud, and then those who are put their trust in the Lord, who are saved by faith.
There was what did you say?
Strong
real
man?
man. What was that?
Oh, the mighty man.
The mighty man. There you go.
The mighty man from Psalm 52. Yeah.
Psalm 52. And this is a great, it's talking about the schemes will bring shame to your house. So once again, we're back to that house metaphor. So is it the actual house? It could be. Maybe all the actions of the populace are living this way in the anti-faith position, but the whole nation as a whole are following that leader in the anti-faith position, and it's bringing shame to the entire nation. And the next sentence there, because you destroyed many nations, and they've conquered so many nations in the anti-faith position, and they've taken those people who may have been in a faith position, and they're trying to mold them into an anti-faith position. But it says you eventually will self-destruct. So there's a cross reference here that I put in Isaiah 10:13-4. He says, by strength of my hand, I have done this, and by wisdom, for I am clever. I have removed the boundaries of nations and plundered their treasures. Like a mighty one, I subdued their rulers. And this ties in exactly to what Babylon was doing and how they were living and conducting their lives. So I know this is is a difficult question for me, but does the church ever behave this way as a whole? And not maybe today, but historically, has there been times in the church when we've behaved like this in the way Babylon was behaving?
I think you have to be more specific. What do you mean by church? You mean like the Catholic Church historically? You mean like our fellowship? You mean like the followers of Jesus?
How about just a corporate church?
So the followers of Jesus?
Yes. Because we could pick apart the Catholics all day long and what they've done, but does it,
well, I didn't mean that in a negative way. I just meant historically there was this government they called themselves the church, and that was the Catholic Church. There were plenty of great people who were part of that government, but then there were also plenty of people who were just, into it for this reason, right? They were doing it for trying to gain for themselves power and whatever, and wealth and whatever. And so definitely there's examples of that. But then if you look at those who were followers of Jesus, who were truly followers of Jesus, it's harder to find examples of that. Yeah. At least on a large scale. Definitely we're all sinners and we all do this to some extent and then get convicted but it's different. So that's why I was asking the question.
And that brings up a great point. If you are in the faith position, if the church is in the faith position, then it's difficult to find examples of this behavior. You'll find backsliding, obviously, but you don't find examples of the anti-faith in the church. But we definitely see it
Even
throughout his-
today.
Yes.
Even today, there definitely are congregations and people who are leaders of congregations who could fit this profile. And but they, again, as you mentioned, they're not living by faith. They're living by pride and trying to set themselves up so they can't fall, just as this verse is talking about.
Right. Right.
I mean, just in using your outline, Tim, when you say, how Babylon lived by anti-faith, selfish ambition, fear and coveting, and then using people. Just, hopefully it doesn't, the drunkenness and idolatry gets a little bit more than that, but like within the church, it's not far-fetched to think people are very capable of those things.
Yeah.
Especially when you get into positions of power unchecked. Certainly there's going to be selfish ambition. Certainly there's going to be a covetousness that is involved with, whether that's in the form of a building or a larger congregation, or some people, jets and, private jets and everything else that comes along with it. And then of course, to do that, you're using people, exploiting people. And we see that along the way, but, yeah, I agree with John. I mean, when you're looking at people that really believe the Lord, he's not going to get us, let us go very far in that any kind of ambition towards those lines. And we're either going to, be snapped back by conviction in a lot of different ways and hopefully respond, or you're going to step into places where you're going to destroy your faith, right? I mean, Paul warns us in Timothy, right? Don't be greedy, don't be covetous, because if you seek to be rich in these things, you're going to pierce your own soul. And that seems to, resonate with what we're saying here about forfeiting your life, about sinning against your own soul. The core of it is this sort of greed that pushes people aside for the selfish gain. It's unfortunate. We'd love to say there are no examples, but I think we, look hard enough, you probably find some. But whether they were true believers that just ignored God's thing, it's a different question. But definitely there, as far as potential, unfortunately, is concerned.
So you mentioned the buildings and the land and all the things that some of the denominations gather and gain, which can definitely throw that belief system into the anti-faith position pretty quickly. What about governments that offer certain tax incentives to the church? Can this influence the church into an anti-faith position?
Yeah, and I think we have to be a little careful too, because we could even go back and look at denominations that have wealth to some degree and have gained property and all of this stuff. But the woe isn't for gaining wealth. The woe is for those who are gaining it through evil gain and who are doing it in this particular manner. So it's not the wealth that is bad. It is that you're doing it through selfish ambition and using people, and there's fear and coveting and all of this, like you have on your outline. It's doing it through that process. And so definitely there are people who can look at government incentives and say, hey, if I use this government incentive, if I claim to be a religious organization, then I don't have to pay taxes on all of this stuff, and they can abuse that. And definitely the woe applies to them, but the woe doesn't apply to people just for taking that incentive.
Yeah.
And I think the difference here is like the Babylon, like that their whole body was like sick, right? Like our church is a body, where we get there's members of the body that are falling sick, but we as a church nurture them and Jesus heals them, but there's a transformation in your heart. I know when I was living my life in sin, I didn't really know I was sick because I wasn't living for Jesus, and my sin, I like to look at sin like cancer. You really don't know that you have cancer until you know.
Yeah.
But when God puts that transformation in your heart, man, like you really don't want to sin because you want to live for God. Like you want people to see that change in you, and God makes that change in you, you know? But I just think that back then, like the Babylon, I want to see like the whole church was sick, you know, like nowadays our church, we're not all sick, you know, we have parts of our body that's sick, you know, but I don't know. That kind of stuck out to me.
No, that's
Like it.
a great example. And John, I'm glad you pointed out the information about ill-gotten gain as opposed to, wealth. Once again, God does not condemn us living with his blessings, but the ill-gotten gain part, and that's the whole crux of all of this, and then into the anti-faith position. And what you brought up, Jake, is there are definitely people in our body that are living in the anti-faith position, but that doesn't kill the entire body. And
exactly.
Hopefully though those individuals, and I shouldn't separate, because we bounce back and forth to the anti-faith position, even the ones who we all think we're not doing it, we do it. And that's how the body, I think, hopefully self-corrects, and it can be gentle, and sometimes it's not gentle. There can be some pretty extreme correction, and scripture allows for that too. If somebody in a leadership position in the church goes astray or starts living in the anti-faith position, there are, Paul directs us on how to correct that. So we are almost.
We got a leader like Jesus Christ, huh?
Exactly.
Set the example.
It's all right. So I was overly ambitious once again. We only got 2 verses. We're gonna get 5. So all right, that's all right. Well, this has been very enlightening. Thank you very much. If somebody would like to close this off in prayer, that'd be fantastic.
I'll do it. You guys are too slow.